It's World War II. Over 30 countries are at war with each other. There is bloodshed, disease widespread, and death as common as catching a cold. Bombs were dropped by airplanes, and these very bombs exploded in the midst of the cities, in the center of the marketplace, and in the industrial hubs where people worked hard for a living. From 1939 to 1945, the fitter, the plumber, the utility worker, and the farmer were all killed like cattle, and blood splashed from the death of over 80 million fatalities. All these events put together made World War II the deadliest conflict in human history. Let's move towards Eastern Europe, that's above Africa, to a country called Germany. Germany was ruled by Adolf Hitler and his troops, and they had spread terror in the region. Adolf Hitler had also understood, or he had opined, that the Jews were an undesirable race and hence had to be eliminated, and therefore ordered their execution. So he deprived them of their civic rights, basic civic rights. He starved them to death, even burned them alive, and confined them to ghettos. He was brutal towards them. It is estimated between 1943 and 1945, about 6.5 million Jews were killed, and out of these 6.5 million Jews, 1.5 million were children. This is known as the Holocaust. Adolf Hitler also had appointed senior army officials who were known as the Gestapos, and they had a sanction, a legal sanction, to be cruel towards the Jews. They would follow the Jews, they would hear what they said, and they would keep a track on all their activities, and plus they were allowed to be brutal and cruel towards them, and so they tortured them. They were also known as the secret service agents of Adolf Hitler and were a terror symbol. Next to Germany was a country called Poland, and Poland was inhabited by the Jews, and it was inhabited by the Polish people. The capital of Poland was Warsaw. However, Hitler had ordered a notice, a public notice, which said anybody found helping the Jews would be eliminated, and their families would also be eliminated. These notices were put up in public places, in the marketplace, on shops and establishments, in construction sites, and in the center of the cities. So the message was loud and clear. If you help the Jews, face death. Now in Warsaw, which was the capital of Poland, in the military services was a nurse who was working over there, and she was in charge of the supplies. That means she was in charge of food, she was in charge of the medicines and the blankets. She had access to all these facilities, and she would often provide these to the Jew people because she would like to help the Jews, though she was a Polish. Within the city of Warsaw, towards one side of this place, was erected a tall wall. This tall wall, on top of it, there was a barbed wire. This wall was round in nature, and there was only one exit and one entry. And the Nazi soldiers stood at this exit and entry point so that nobody could move in and out except under their supervision. Now within this small 4 square kilometers area were dumped and were tortured 4 lakh Jews. They were stripped of their civic rights, they had no employment, food was a shortage, so death was common, and the spread of epidemics because of the unhygienic and unsanitary living conditions which were there Typhoid and cholera were endemics that were commonly found, and people died because of these diseases which they suffered from. Irina Sendlers would walk into this Warsaw ghetto on the pretext of being a sanitary inspector. She had a bag in her hand and she said she is going to look into these deplorable areas as the disease had widespread over there. Now, the Nazi soldiers were afraid of contracting these diseases like typhoid and cholera, and so they would allow her to go in freely into the Warsaw ghetto. On one of her such rounds, which she made in the Warsaw ghetto, she observed a group of children. They were walking towards the freight yard in their best dressed clothes. And she was wondering why they're walking in their best dressed clothes towards the freight yard. And it suddenly struck her that they were walking towards their death. She was horrified by this incident, and there was so much trauma on her head and heart that she had to be hospitalized. Once she came out of the hospitals, she went and met the parents, the Jew parents who were inside the Warsaw ghetto, and shared with them that you have to hand over your children to me if you want them alive. Now the question is, why would a Jew parent who knows Irina only a few days ago want to hand over their child to her? With a lot of discussion, with a lot of deliberation and a lot of debate, it was finally decided, yes, the parents do not have any other choice but to hand over their child to Irina. So they decided they would go ahead with this plan. Irina, first and foremost, she made a list of the names of these children and she gave them German names. And in front of that, she put the parents' names. So she could identify who was the child and who was the parent. This entire list, she folded it and put it in a jar. And she took this jar and buried it under an apple tree which was in the center of the Warsaw ghetto, so that she knows how to identify the children and the parents. Now, if it was an older child who could walk and move around, say around 8 or 10 years of age, she instructed that child to run towards the manhole in the Warsaw ghetto. After the soldiers, the Nazi soldiers, had finished patrolling in the wee hours of the morning. So once the child ran towards the manhole, he was quickly hurried down and tracked down and taken away under a tunnel which opened onto a church outside the ghetto. Once he or she, the child, reached the ghetto through the network of the people that helped Irina, this child's clothes were changed, the names were changed, and it was handed over to the families that had agreed to house these children. She also put children in potato sacks and she put children in waste bags, and she took them outside the Warsaw ghetto. The Nazis did not suspect any foul play. But another thing that she did was that she often drove the military truck. And in this military truck or ambulance, there were medicines, there were blankets, and there were food supplies. So she would tuck children under the blanket and drive out of the Warsaw ghetto through the only entrance and exit gate in front of the Nazi soldiers. They did not suspect any foul play. But what happened when the child or the baby was only 6 months old? She would take the infant and put it in a toolbox, a sanitary toolbox, and lock the toolbox, and she would drug the infant before she put it in the toolbox and take the toolbox and walk outside the ghetto. But there was a risk here. Suppose the baby or this infant started crying. She was prepared. She had trained a dog who would bark louder than the cries of the infant who was in the toolbox, and so that the voice of this child's or the baby's cries would be submerged. And she would take the baby outside the Warsaw ghetto. The Nazis did not smell any foul play. In this manner, she managed to save the lives of 2,500 children from the Warsaw ghetto. But all was not well, and the Nazis smelled something was wrong. And so the Gestapos caught Irina by the collar and they beat her black and blue. They broke her legs and they beat her hands and they beat her arms. Her feet also bled, but she would not reveal. the names of these children. And so they ordered her execution. The next day at 6 o'clock in the morning, Irina was to be executed. But it so happened, the previous day, the group of people who worked with Irina, as she was very well networked, bribed the executioner. And so the next day in the morning, before 6 o'clock, the executioner helped Irina to escape, and she ran away to the jungles. And she waited there for the war to be over. In 1945, when the war was over, Irina came back. Irina came back to the Warsaw Ghetto, she came back to the apple tree, and she came back to the jar which she had buried under the apple tree. She took out that jar and she tried to find out if there was anyone alive whom she could reunite, as the parents and children were separated. But destiny chose otherwise. All the children had escaped, but the parents who stayed back were all killed during the war. This story was not known to the world till a group of history students in the Kansas State University, USA, were working on their project. Irina saved the lives of 2,500 children from the Warsaw Ghetto and found significance and meaning in her life. I urge upon all of us to find out the purpose of our lives and then make it significant by contributing to this world so that it becomes a better place.